So, shalom and welcome to another edition of Parasha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamed in Highland Park, New Jersey, at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation on Shemet. And joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Barry Chesler, Solomon Sheikh Day School of Long Island, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky on Sheikh Chesed. We are starting, as we always start now during these months, 230, day 230. We're recording this, praying for the release of the hostages and for the relief of all the suffering that their families, and everyone is experiencing during this time, thinking of them and all the tribulations now that are deep in the Jewish people. We are also in a season of completions and the end of the year. We celebrated the graduation this past week. Elisheva graduated, so Mazel Tov to my daughter Elisheva,
Mazel
who
Tov to Elisheva, and Mazel Tov to Rabbi Malamed, who for the first time in 25, 6, 7 years does not have a child in tuition bearing.
well, there you go. So I think we need to invent a mazinka for graduates, right? You know, the mazinka, the last child that gets married, you need to have a mazinka for the last child who graduates. Anyway, Bahar, Parshat Bahar is our parsha this week, and this is it's going to take us really to the end of the book of Vayikra, and you know let's start with some low hanging fruit, just the first verse, and you know what, it's in a sentimentality that I want you to quote for me that first Rashi on the first verse. I'm gonna pitch the ball to Barry here and just and lob it over. What does Rashi say on the first verse and how that enters the language here?
So the verse in the Torah is Vayidaber Adonai Moshe Bahar Sinai Lemor, and God spoke to Moshe at Har Sinai saying, and Rashi's great comment is Manyan Shemitah Eitzel Har Sinai. What is the reason to mention Sinai right here in the discussion of the sabbatical year laws? Because we assume as traditional Jews that the whole Torah was revealed at Mount Sinai. And so we don't need this extra phrase here. So I think I may have mentioned this before. This actually entered Israeli TV on the show called Kojak, which older people might remember fondly.
Who loves you, baby?
Because the phrase that Kojak said, what does this have to do with the price of tea in China, which became in Hebrew, Manyan Shemitah Eitzel Har Sinai.
Yeah.
And it's a wonderful way, I think. I learned about this in the context of a woman, Debbie Weissman, a great Israeli educator, talking about how she became an Israeli, the process that she went through. And here she was emphasizing how important the Hebrew language is to Israeli culture, which carries with it all sorts of weight, shall we say, embedded in the language. So even though an average Israeli might not care who Rashi was and know nothing at all about the Shemitah year, still in the course of conversation will say a line of Rashi and mention the sabbatical year. And that gives them a certain entree into Jewish identity that most of us in the diaspora simply don't have.
Well, you know what? I mean, this is actually a good segue into another example that comes out of this parsha, which is chapter 25:10, which refers to the Jubilee year. And of course, if you know your American history, you will know that the following words are quoted on a very special object. Ukratem dror ba'aretz, you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land.
And to all the inhabitants thereof.
All the inhabitants thereof, which is found on the Liberty Bell, which is presently housed in it got moved recently, I think, or no,
Well, it's in Philadelphia.
it's in Philadelphia.
They can't
Okay.
have moved it too far.
And just a small dig into the internet on the history of the Liberty Bell reveals that the Liberty Bell was commissioned 50 years after William Penn's Declaration or whatever. It was to mark a 50th anniversary. And the whole idea then that the language of the Bible is part of the language of early America, and it becomes part of American culture.
Right. And what's important to note is that it was even for those who lacked a formal education, the Bible was read and known.
Yeah.
People made reference to it in conversation, and it was a very important part of being an American.
Right.
I like this point about colonial America, where everything you said is quite correct. And I took a class when I was in college, these many years ago, in which it was about the great writers of the middle of the 19th century: Emily Dickinson, Herman Melville, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne. And the teacher said that the greatest writer of the American 19th century is Abraham Lincoln,
Right.
who had minimal formal education, but his basic education was reading the Bible.
And Shakespeare. He also knew Shakespeare
And,
quite well.
and I didn't know that, but the cadences, first of all, the specific, especially from the Christian scriptures, the specific references, as in the second inaugural, but the cadences and the power of these, heavy, almost liturgical phrases, they shape American English. And I really want to just triple down on what Barry was saying about the power of Hebrew in contemporary Israel. Sure. People may not know where stuff comes from, or not know that this or that is a verse, but it's everywhere you go. And in 1923, Gershom Scholem, was a young bourgeois German who was growing in his passion for Jewish study, and in his Zionism, came to Israel, came to Free State Palestine, and he wrote to his, sort of senior colleague, friend, and teacher, Franz Rosenzweig, that this is one of the most prescient observations. He said, people here think they are speaking a modern language, but they are, dangerously unaware of the religious power that's within the language, and it will explode. The Hebrew will explode from within, and they may think that they're just engaging in, secular life, but they're not. And I think Scholem was proven correct that the, revolutionary power of people of Ben Gurion, of Beryl Katznelson and their generation, and the renewal of Hebrew, it really did, contain a whole religious energy that over the last bunch of years in Israel has become a much more Jewish, connected to Jewish sources and tradition society than perhaps it ever was.
As long as you mentioned Franz Rosenzweig, a quick little anecdote about Martin Buber related to the Hebrew language. So Buber in German, who was a gifted German stylist, he invented and pushed the borders of German language significantly, was quite obscure in the number of his important works. And when he came to Israel, people said he doesn't quite know Hebrew well enough yet to be obscure, so you could actually understand what he's saying.
This is, such a great idea in terms of how the Torah itself impacts the language, and we've gone through different examples of that in different editions of the Parsha Talk, and thinking of it, we get a few words here: Shemitah, Yovel. These are words that are part of Hebrew language, and convey the sense of rhythm of time, the cycle of time. I just want to, just for the sake of overview, these laws are telling a story. I think they're telling a story of a people in its land and how they are going to settle in the land and work the land and live with the rhythm of the land. To what extent is this a utopian ideal that the land rests on the seventh year? It's a Shabbat Ladonai, a Sabbath for God. And to what extent it's a utopian ideal that every 7 groups of 7 years, every 49 years, the land will have a Shemitah, and then on the 50th year, there will be a Jubilee year, and then everything will reset. Basically, it's a social and economic reset. So I want to ask really what the vision is here and what the story is. And in terms of, you're an average Israelite, how you are relating to this story, and more directly, what is the purpose of these rules, and what kind of mindset is it trying to create in the average Israelite? Barry, go ahead.
So I think that as we get to the end of Vayikra, it's worth taking a global look at the book. And part of the book, which is filled with instruction for and by priests, is really to answer the question, what does it mean to be God's people? And I think in particular, Shemitah and Yovel, the sabbatical and the Jubilee year, are addressed to this very point, because the religious life is bound by time as much as by space, and we have to be aware of the cycles of life. I think when I was younger, I would have thought this was much more utopian. First of all, it's very difficult to understand based on the Parsha how the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year were observed in practice, especially because the sabbatical year seems to rely upon a 3-year miracle every 7 years. Because you can't plant in the 7th year, you're not going to have any crops in the 8th year either. And so how are you going to eat in the 7th and 8th year? It's only in the 9th year that you're going to again, and it's hard to square that with the way we know that nature works. Also, the timing of the Jubilee year is problematic because you have 7 times 7-year cycles. So the 49th year is a sabbatical year, and then you have another year where you're not going to do anything, the Jubilee year.
Right.
So, but I think, as we were talking before the show, I think there is a pragmatic part to this, and it comes to remind us that we are Avadim Hayinu in the best sense of the word to God. We are God's servants, and we must submit ourselves to God's rule. And we know from living in this country and having lived a certain number of years that people who acquire land and money seem to think that oftentimes they are better than people who lack land and money. And these laws come to tell us quite the opposite, that whatever land and money you've acquired is only yours for a little while, and then it has to be returned to the original owner, the one who got the original tribal allocation in the time of Joshua, but ultimately to God, because God is the landlord.
So go ahead, Jeremy. Or you want to say something? No.
I don't, I mean, this is quite correct. And it is a affirmation because there's like a basic assumption that the original Chalukah, the original land division, which was executed by, it hasn't, quote, happened yet here in Vayikra, but it'll happen in Yehoshua, and Moses envisions it, is like fundamentally just that everybody gets a second chance. And so there's a restart, and if you've accumulated wealth, you have to, we have some, just like on Shabbat, there is some weekly Shabbat, there is some imaginary equality among all people. And, obviously some people have rich and some people have more, but you won't work on Shabbat. And so there's some kind of imagined experience of equality. And so too, it is on the septennial, the 7-year cycle, some temporary, but using your powers of imagination, real equality. I was just going to say that there's the word Yovel, which they obviously, the English translators into the Bible couldn't come up with anything, so they just rendered the letters Jubilee into English parlance or whatever. But if I'm not mistaken, just the way it is used, at least part of the time in the Bible, is that it means the horn. When in the Sinai episode, it says that the people they have to stay away from the mountain, they come back to the mountain, bimshocha yovel, when the horn blast stops. And in the story of Joshua, and I believe this is at Jericho, I think it's Jericho, the hayabim shoch bekeren hayovel, when you blow the horn, this Yovel animal horn trumpet, and you hear the sound of the shofar, all the people will shout, and then the walls of Jericho will fall down. So I don't know exactly what you do with the fact that the word for the horn becomes the word for the institution of the economic reset that is initiated with the blast of a horn. It's like the experience, and I think maybe because the word appears in Exodus 19, where, it's such an important passage in the Torah, there may be something going on here, at least between the lines, or maybe I'm reading into it, but then I'll just read into it, that somehow economic inequality, economic equality, second chances, reset, somehow is like a kind of revelation. You hear that through the sound of the horn, and it's like hearing it at Sinai, and it's like hearing it at Jericho, and maybe I can come up with some other examples, but I just like the fact that the word Jubilee really just means the year of the horn blast.
Interesting. I'm just looking at the verse, chapter 25:9, where it talks about how the day, the year is declared. So it's v'safarta lecha, the previous verse, count your 7 weeks of years 7 times, and you'll have 49 years. V'havarta, verse 9, v'havarta shofar trua b'chodesh hashvi'i. You are to cause to pass the blast of the shofar in the 7th month, be'asor lachodesh, on the 10th day, b'yom kippurim, on Yom Kippur, ta'aviru shofar b'chol arsechem. You are to have it pass through your entire land. So go
Wait,
ahead.
keep reading one more pasuk. Read one more pasuk.
V'kidashtem et shnata chamishim shana. You will sanctify the 50th year. Ukratem dor la'aretz, ba'aretz l'chol yoshveh, and you will proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. Yovel hi tiyeh lachem. The Yovel year it will be for you. V'shavtem ish elachuzato. Each person will return to his landing, his portion. V'ish el mishpachto tashuvu, and every man will return to his family.
So what's interesting to me is that it's not clear here when on Yom Kippur the shofar would be sounded. It could be at the beginning or it could be at the end. Now, today in our synagogues, we sound it at the end, in part because we don't know when the Jubilee year might be. So we blow it every year, because one of the years might
That's the reason why we blow it at the end.
It is.
It's not to say the fast is over, go and eat.
Well, I think that became the derivative reason. Actually, I shouldn't say which one is the derivative reason. That may be the original reason, or it could be secondary. But I heard the story about the Jubilee year, many, many years ago.
I say that every year. I say that every year at Anshe Chesed. This is the year we're all going free. And actually, my friends, let's be a little poetic here and say it's not one or the other. It's both of these two things. So now let's read this pasuk 10 with that typical rabbinic hyperliteralism in when in interpreting with the hyperliteralism. Speaking of Buber and Rosenzweig, their translation, they bring out the awkwardness. So it makes it like this: Kidashtem eshnat chamishim shana, and you shall hallow the 50th year. Ukratem dror ba'aretz l'chol yoshveh, proclaim liberty the land to all its inhabitants. Yovel hi tiyeh lachem. That's the horn blast. V'shavtem ish el achuzato. And now you can all go home. Ve'el mishpachto tashuvu, and you can all return to your clans. And that's how it works at the end of Yom Kippur. You can all go home now, and you are free.
Well, that's nice.
You get to restart.
Well, so it actually makes a better drash on the modern version of Yom Kippur rather than the biblical version, because we sound it on Yom Kippur because that's when we return to God. So we are embodying the Levitical commandment in a world without a temple by blowing the shofar, which announces the return of everything to God in the 50th year, just as we have on Yom Kippur returned to God.
So just let me, as we're speaking about Yom Kippur, I will confess, I never think about this on Yom Kippur. I never think about the Jubilee.
Well, now you have what to think about.
I know. Okay, fine. Thank you. That's very sweet. But and of course we'll add this layer of interpretation. But just because of my religious sentimentality, I, drift to the sense of catharsis, the sense that the blast of the shofar, which is a herald in other ways at the beginning of Elul all the way, is now coming to its completion. And so it's a coda, it's a terminus, it's the final yell, the final attempt to break the gates of the
So it's worth thinking about, since you raised the point, is what do we imagine the shofar blast in Vayikra was? It says Truah, which for us is three triplets of three notes.
no, it's the 9 notes.
Yeah,
Those are
it's three, they're three
three
triplets.
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry.
And but what we do in shul is the whole
Of the
sequence.
well, at
And I think the note that best fits, for me at least, Yom Kippur is the Shvarim, which is more plaintive than the other two.
but and we're talking about the end of Yom Kippur. It's a Tekiah Gedola. It's just one long blast.
Well, because that's where the catharsis is in the
Yeah.
processing of the notes.
Right. But there's no. I mean, the other notes were Rosh Hashanah notes.
Yeah, I think that obviously the richness of the Yelule Yelil, the Genuche Ganach, the groaning of the Shvarim and the screeching of the Truah have different resonances, especially on Yom Kippur and in the way that you're saying. I'm going to think now that that the word here just means horn proclamation, and it's probably more just like the Tekiah, but that really works, because if it is the message of liberation, you are starting over and now you are free. I can feel it, that note. I can really feel it in the show.
So in other words, what you're saying is that the Yom Kippur, the conclusion of Yom Kippur for us has as its multivocality freedom, the sense that you're to begin again.
It's a particular kind of freedom, because before we blow the shofar, we say the three verses: Shema Yisrael, and Baruch Shem Kavod, and the Adonai Hu Elohim, which comes to complete Rosh Hashanah for us, which is the coronation of God, and then we accept that God is our King.
Well, I'm in such a different place on that, because
that's because you've been fasting.
No, it's not, because I just let me make it darker here, which is that this is a vidui. This is the vidui of death. This is what you say over the dying person. This is what you say. These are the final declarations of faith here, and that you want to create a set of symbols in your language that says one part of my life has terminated and another now begins.
So you're returning.
I'm returning.
And you might as well quote the line from the song. Hineni, I am ready, my Lord.
I'm ready. But we've made it so banal, because we are ready to go home and have a bagel. Is what we've done.
I'm finding it is interesting to me, because I do relate to, the one, you want it darker, and I do relate, but not about Yom Kippur though. I do, I do get, especially in that amazing Leonard Cohen song, but I don't really. I'm gonna run the cause and effect arrows the other way, at least provisionally. I'm open to revisiting this, but Shema, Baruch Shem, Adonai Hu HaElohim. It's not that at the end of the Yom Kippur you recite the deathbed confessional. It's at the deathbed you recite the Yom Kippur affirmation. It's that you and especially because of the cathartic moment, because also you remember the Mishnah, and we've discussed that in the Mishnah in Ta'anit, it ends off with the idea that the day of matchmaking, eros, life affirming, was Yom Kippur, that people dressed in white and they made matches because they were coming out of the day of Inui, you know, kol nefesh lo te'uneh be'etzem hayom hazeh, any soul that doesn't afflict itself on this day is nichrata nefesh ahi me'ameha, is separated from their people. But you come out on the other end and you affirm that life is good and you are going to go forward and you're going to rebuild the world the way it ought to be. So I feel like the cathartic moment of the end of Yom Kippur is a high and joyful moment.
Which is the culmination of a life well lived, a life lived in repentance and tshuva and an arrival. Look, it's really wonderful to hold opposite ideas. And I'm thinking of the late Alan Lew, Alav Shalom, Rabbi Lew, who wrote that book, on the holidays. You are not prepared.
This is real. This is completely real, and you are completely unprepared.
Exactly. It's a beautiful, beautiful title in which he goes at length and describes the whole season, but Yom Kippur in particular is a rehearsal of death. And he makes a very compelling point. So just as you would say that the kittel is for, marriage, he would say, look, the kittel is worn at death. Or some would say the kittel is worn at marriage because,
That's equivalent to death. Yeah, we got it. But there's also something prosaic here. And the reason why you go eat the bagel after Yom Kippur is because you're glad to be alive. And how do we testify that we're glad to be alive? We eat.
Yeah.
Right? Fasting is not a symbol of life. It's preparation for something. And in a sense, all of Yom Kippur is preparation for us to really enjoy that bagel.
I think the reason you eat the bagel is that it is round, like life, the circle of life.
And it has a hole in it.
And it has locks on it, and locks is totally yummy.
Indeed. Okay, so we can see that life is filled with humor for sure.
That was the great thing of Jerry Seinfeld. Jerry Seinfeld's slightly controversial. A few anti-Zionist, let's even call them anti-Semitic protesters, walked out at Duke. Jerry Seinfeld got the great talk though. He said, listen, you guys are great. You're gonna make the world a better place, but just remember to laugh at the world. You're still gonna need a lot of humor because the world, even if it's a better place, is still not gonna make a lot of sense. And you need to laugh at it from time to time.
Absolutely. Let's end on a note. Jeremy, I want you to talk about achicha. Talk about the recurrence of this word in the parsha through all of the different permutations, the commandments that relate to achicha, your brother.
Yes. So in the latter part, we talked about the way the Jubilee year and the Shemitah year, which equalizes the Shemitah year, which equalizes land ownership, that it belongs to nobody, it belongs to God. Everybody has an equal share of all the apples on the tree. And Jubilee constitutes an economic restart. Everybody goes home to a presumptively fair and just and equitable ancestral holding. Everybody's got a share. And then the latter part of chapter 25 goes on to discuss a series of kind of emergency measures. Bad stuff's going to happen, and you're going to have to come through. And what's interesting to me, among if you look at in Deuteronomy and in Exodus, there are these commandments about sabbatical years and tzedakah. Those appear in those other books too. And they speak about the people, but when in Leviticus chapter 25, it speaks about the treatment that Israelites will have of their fellows. I'm speaking now on a literary level. It always refers, every time that it refers to the economically struggling person, as achicha, your brother. So verse 25, Ki yamuch achicha umachar me'achuzato, if your kinsman, achicha, your brother, is so bad off that they have to sell off their ancestral holdings, so a near relative, the closest relative, has to come back and pay the debt off and restore to the kinsman the land that has been alienated. And that's the first of those examples. And then you get a few more if you sell off your ancestral house. Let me roll down a little more. Verse 35. V'chi yamuch achicha umata yado imach. And if your brother is even worse straits and comes under your authority, you have to strengthen that person and let them live with you. And we'll go on. And let's say it gets even worse off. V'nim karlach, and he sold himself as a slave to you. Lo ta'avod bo avodat abed. You can't treat him like a slave. And he gets even worse off. Gets worse off, and he even has to sell himself to non-Israelites. Then you really have to come through. My point in saying all this is, in Leviticus, it could say, if a human being, if an Israelite, if another of your, no, it refers to all of these economically suffering people as your brother. And I think the literary effect is to awaken a strong sense of commitment and fellow feeling, which is the hallmark of an excellent society. These other people, who are they? Are they strangers? Are they your competitors? Are they your rivals? They are your brethren. That's the key thing about this passage.
What I would add is the necessity to validate people as human beings requires you to look at them as your brother. I'm sure we've all had the experience, especially in Manhattan, being accosted by someone asking for money, and the tendency a lot of times is to look away as if it's not even a person in front of us. And it's so important, I think, although my success rate is not as high as it should be, to look at the person and greet the person, even if you're not going to give them any money, because they are a human being created in God's image. And this passage, I think, emphasizes how critical that is to a just society.
Yeah, it's interesting that, in a society that is a society of kinship, where everyone is related and where there is a sense that there's this familial bond. Look, I do think that you have that more so in Israel than you have in America, precisely because of the shared sense of destiny, shared sense of kinship, the familial bond. I mean, this is a theme that is very fresh in my mind. Having listened today to one podcast, the Israeli journalist Chavi Retek-Gur, talking about Israel's still in the top 10 of the happiest places on earth, or among the happiest people. The number, it went down from 5 to 6 or 6 to 7. And one of the reasons is because of a shared sense of social connectedness that we in America do not have. We have a very atomized sense, very individualized, very lonely sense. People are detached from each other, and so the notion of achicha, your brother, is both as an aspirational statement that you ought to look at every person as your kin, but it's also a declarative statement that is a description of what exists, that your bond is to each other because of your kinship also. Well, here we've come to the end of another episode. Me and my brothers, Achim, we are all brothers in the study of Torah, and of course we thank our brothers and sisters who are watching and listening to us. You know what? At the graduation recently, one of our recent graduates came up to me and said, "I watch you every week. Thank you so much. I get some great ideas for my own Divrei Torah from your the show. That's the best compliment that we get. We get that from time to time. We're happy that you take the things that we talk about and weave them into your own Divrei Torah, and that gives us. We couldn't think of a better way to be honored by that. In the meantime, thank you for watching. Look forward to seeing you in the next edition of Parasha Talk. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.